Can we really blame Google for not paying more tax? Tonight, the wider debate. Do higher taxes simply make the system less effective? Hello, good evening. You might as well, Boris Johnson wrote today, blame a shark for eating seals. It is the nature of the beast. It's the law. He was talking about Google and its tax bill. His point was simple: how absurd to blame a company for attempting to minimise the amount it pays out to the government when it lies at the very root of what any finance director is paid to do. So tonight we step back from one company, one bill, and ask if that really holds. Is it immoral to use a loophole to your company's advantage, or common sense? And what should this whole debate tell us about our attitude to taxation and the message our legislators send out with the rules they make? In a moment, we'll talk to Labour's Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who called the Google settlement of £130 million relatively insignificant, and ask what Labour would do. First, here's David Grossman.
If you look closely enough and have the right equipment, you can even see the apparently tiny sums that multinational corporations pay in UK tax. Under the political microscope today, the £130 million settlement that Google has paid in back taxes in a deal with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. According to the Shadow Chancellor, this is a derisory sum.
The Chancellor has managed to create an unlikely alliance between myself, the Sun newspaper, the Mayor of London, and according to reports, even Number 10 this morning. All of us think that this deal is not the, in quotes, major success the Chancellor claimed at the weekend.
Right, show us what you've got then.
The Chancellor, who was touring a lab that helps in the fight against malaria, rejected Labour's analysis.
Look, I think it's good news that we are collecting tax from companies like Google. That's thanks to the action that this government has taken to make sure that, yes, we have low taxes in Britain, but those taxes are paid.
But is the real problem that our tax system hasn't kept pace with our changing economy? According to the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee, corporation tax in a given country is now largely voluntary for multinational companies. And that's particularly true of high-tech companies like Google.
Most of its value is created by intangibles. Intangibles are very mobile, and that's what exactly the current tax system is not very good at getting.
Google, for example, uses a manoeuvre known as the double Irish, shifting profits between Ireland, with low corporate rates of tax, and Bermuda, with no corporate rates of tax. The problem for nation states is this is all perfectly legal, and as our economies evolve, more and more companies will be able to do it.
What constitutes the correct amount of tax is becoming an elastic concept. Google is the symptom, but they're probably not the cause. We have to consider now fundamental reform of the tax system, and particularly the corporate tax system, if we're to protect the tax base for the next 25 years.
Because even if the executives of a company woke up one day and decided out of the goodness of their hearts that their corporation should pay vastly more tax, well, the people who own those companies would most likely disagree.
If Google met the expectations of perhaps the Labour Party, then they could face a monumental legal case in America where the shareholders would accuse them of giving away money unnecessarily.
So how might we change the tax system then so that companies can't shift their profits and costs between competing tax jurisdictions? Well, one answer is to tax something they can't move.
If instead we decide to tax on sales with some deductions, we will always be able to see what the sales are, right? So we will be able to link the activity of the company with taxation, essentially, something that we are not able to do now.
The science to pay more is far from simple. The twin forces of globalisation and computerisation make national boundaries, even in activities as mundane as ordering a coffee, buying a book or hailing a cab, essentially meaningless.
That was David Grossman. We're joined now by the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. Thanks for coming in. John, this payout by Google hasn't impressed you?
No, it's independent assessors have assessed it at about 3% of. And comparison with that, well, the corporation tax during this period was between 20 and 30%. So other taxpayers, particularly businesses in this country, I think will be quite startled and offended by this. What should it have been then? I mean, you go back to the corporate tax rate. What should that corporate tax rate be now? Well, again, independent assessors have said if Google were paying what others were paying throughout that period, instead of the 200 million they've paid for the 10 years, on average they'll be paying about 200 million a year. So you can see why people across the House, it was all parties today, MPs from all parties, were expressing their concern, and it was described by Boris Johnson himself as a derisory sum.
But the bigger question is whether the current tax system itself works. You heard Andrew Tyrie there say the correct amount of tax is an elastic concept. That's why I go back to what it should be. Do you agree now that the whole system is right for reform?
Andrew's announced a review by the Treasury Select Committee today of our tax system. We've already instituted one through the Labour Party already. I did that at my conference speech last September. The system's not working. Let me just say a couple of problems. One is a lack of transparency and openness. The Chancellor didn't come to the House of Commons today. He sent a junior minister who couldn't even tell us what the effective rate of tax for Google is. We need complete openness and transparency. We need international agreements now about country-by-country reporting so that individual companies are reporting what their economic activities and their profits are country by country. And can I say also, I raised with the Minister today, we cannot keep on cutting and demoralising the staff at HMRC. These are the people who collect the taxes. Every time we lay someone off, we're actually reducing our ability to ensure there is a fair tax system.
OK, so transparency right at the heart of this. Labour's plans to balance the books will be aggressive, you said at the conference, will force people like Starbucks, Vodafone, Amazon, Google to pay their fair share of taxes. What does that mean, to go after them aggressively?
It means we cannot allow deals like this in the future. We've got to ensure we design our tax system so it's effective, and then if anyone offends against that, we actually make sure they're brought to book.
Just explain to me then, that's the end of the double Irish, that's the end of loopholes. What would you do with the corporate tax rate now?
This is what I thought George Osborne was supporting. International agreements which actually ensures that we don't have these schemes in place. This scheme seems to undermine those very international agreements we're putting forward because it's a one-off that sets a precedent for the future.
But just tell me what you would actually do, because you use this word aggressive. So in terms of what you would change now, what are the loopholes that just vanish under Labour?
It's making sure they report their activities on the ground so they can't shift their profits where they make them in one country. And remember, Google made £1 billion worth of profits in 2014. They then shift those profits and other areas of activity to other countries' low tax regimes.
OK, so it should, for example, Starbucks be taxed on each individual outlet, each of the profits of an individual coffee shop? Is that what you'd like to see?
Well, part of our review is to define what economic activity is. My view is if the profits are made within a country, they should be taxed within that country. But we need to do this by international agreement. Otherwise, we'll find that people are using devices to shift their burdens elsewhere and reduce their tax burdens overall.
But just go back to that idea then. Would you like to see, for example, Starbucks as an individual outlet taxed on profits? Or would you like to see local authorities refuse planning permission to Starbucks until they agree to pay what is right?
I think we need, first of all, national legislation reform, and we need international agreement. So it's not down to individual sanctions by individual authorities.
This, as you know, is an EDM, an early day motion, that was sponsored by Jeremy Corbyn, your leader, and signed by you. So
that's right.
Has it now changed in your mind, or
not at all.
Have you thrown it out?
See, we've been campaigning on this for nearly 15 or 20 years when other people weren't even interested in it. And we were looking at different devices to raise the publicity around that. That was one idea that one of the tax justice campaigns came up with.
So it was just to raise publicity then? It wasn't serious?
No, it was to ensure there are a range of activities that are on the agenda that we can then explore when we go into government.
OK.
And that's what our review is going to do.
What about a tax on sales? What about taxing the activity of a company, its revenue or its sales? Does that seem like a good idea?
Well, at the moment, the government defines this taxation based upon economic activity within the country. The problem with the Google settlement today...
But we know it's taxed on profits at the moment.
No, let's be clear. What the government is saying is that it's taxed on economic activity. They would not define today in the Google settlement what exactly that economic activity was. That's why we're saying there's got to be openness and transparency.
What should it be then?
Well, I think we define economic activity by the basis of the profits that you secure within a country.
OK, so it's still down to profits, but I'm just asking you one step further. Can you imagine a tax system which actually worked off the revenues a company was making, or the sales it was making, rather than the profits? Is that the direction to go in?
We've always worked on the basis that you seek to tax on the economic activity, and that's largely based upon an identification of profits within the country itself. Now, if we can secure, first of all, openness and transparency, we can identify what the economic activities of that company is within the country, what the profits are, and then we can determine the level of taxation that we need to, basically to ensure that we have our services paid for. But also we'll need international agreement so there isn't this transfer and avoidance of taxation.
From one to another.
Yes.
I'm just thinking back to that phrase you used at the conference. You said new politics requires new economics. And there will be people expecting John McDonnell to come in and do something radically different, to really reset the button between that relationship with the corporate giants that seem to people to be getting away with it and with the government in waiting, which you wanted to be. This sounds like more of the same. You said transparency, you've said a debate, you said we'll talk about this, we'll look at this.
Not at all.
I don't see anyone saying we're going to do things radically different, we're going to have new economics.
This is radical. This is radical. Making sure companies open their books and we can have complete openness and transparency.
But it's just about transparency. You're not actually saying we're going to put up the corporate tax rate, right?
Wait for it. Once you get openness and transparency, you can then determine the economic activities within the country, the profits that they're making. We can then set our tax rates on the basis of what we think is fair. What's unfair at the moment is companies out there right the way across the UK are filling in their tax forms, as are individuals, and what they're paying is rates of tax on corporation tax 20%, higher in income tax, and yet at the same time we have Google paying 3%. That's unacceptable, unfair. What we need to do is make sure those corporations cannot use tax avoidance measures to avoid their responsibilities to paying for the public services that they depend upon, for example, the education and training of their workers.
There were people who felt at one time that they should boycott Starbucks if they didn't agree with the tax that they were paying. Would you boycott Google for the same reason?
Well, I've been involved in a whole range of campaigns, boycotting campaigns.
Do you boycott Google?
Well, it's the problem that we've got at the moment is a number of these information technology companies have got virtual monopolies, so therefore most of us use it. But what we've got to do is make sure where they are in such a dominant place.
So you still carry on using Google broadly? I mean, there's nothing that you can actually do that would scare off Google?
Because they're so dominant within the market, that's the reality of what we're dealing with. But that's why you design a tax regime, so you ensure those monopolies pay, oligopolies really, pay their full taxes and contribute towards the society that they operate in.
You can basically see that nothing's going to scare Google off or make it pay more
yes,
tax.
it is.
And it's going to be John McDonnell and the Labour Party, is it?
I think it's going to be society as a whole. We saw in the House of Commons today the government isolated, but on a cross-party basis, people saying we've had enough of this, we want a fair taxation system, and we're going to achieve it.
Corporate tax at 18%, that's where it's headed. Does that sound like the right amount to you?
No, it isn't. It's too low. We would bring it back to the 20% because we believe 18% is too low. In addition to that, they're reducing taxation, yet a large number of these corporations and companies are sitting on earned income and not investing it. We want to ensure that they invest in our society.
John McDonnell, thank you. Thanks for coming in.